After discovering that his wife, Clara, was battling a terminal illness, Victor, the man who vowed to protect her, made the unthinkable choice. Instead of standing by her side through the darkest period of her life, he betrayed her trust. For 2 months, he pretended to care, attending appointments and offering false reassurances, while secretly meeting his mistress, Gabriella. Clara's world had already crumbled after losing her parents in a tragic car accident just days before her diagnosis. Alone and vulnerable, she leaned on Victor, unaware that his plans didn't include her recovery. He intended to wait out her illness, inherit her wealth, and build a new life with Gabriella. The betrayal reached its peak when he abandoned Clara during her chemotherapy, leaving her a note claiming he couldn't handle the burden. Clara was left utterly broken. Her fragile body ached from the treatments, but the pain in her heart was far worse. Alone, rejected, and grieving her parents, she had never felt so defeated. But in the depths of her despair, a seed of strength began to grow, a resolve to find her own way, no matter how painful the journey. The house was too quiet, the kind of quiet that didn't soothe but instead screamed of abandonment. Clara sat on the edge of the bed, her frail body wrapped in a wool blanket that once belonged to her late mother. The faint smell of her parents' old home still lingered on the fabric, a bittersweet reminder of the safety she'd lost. Tears trickled down her cheeks as she stared at her wedding photo on the nightstand. Victor's smile, once a symbol of love and protection, now felt like a cruel mockery of the life they'd built, or the illusion of it. Clara was drowning in grief. Just weeks earlier, her parents had been her greatest source of comfort. They were the kind of people who would drop everything to make sure she was okay, even if it meant putting their own lives on hold. But now they were gone, taken in a sudden and devastating car accident. The shock of losing them was still fresh, a raw wound she couldn't stop reopening. She hadn't even had time to fully process their deaths before her own life was thrown into chaos. The cancer diagnosis had come just days after the funeral. The doctor's voice had been gentle but firm, explaining the severity of her condition and the urgency of starting treatment. Victor had been there, holding her hand tightly, promising her they would face it together. "You're not alone," he had said, his eyes locked on hers with an intensity she had clung to. But it was all a lie. The first signs of his betrayal were subtle. He started coming home later than usual, offering vague excuses about work or errands. When Clara needed him to accompany her to the hospital, he would sigh heavily before reluctantly agreeing. His once reassuring words became curt, his touch distant. At first, Clara convinced herself it was the stress of her illness affecting him. After all, who wouldn't struggle in such circumstances? But as the days turned into weeks, the truth began to surface. One night, after a particularly grueling round of chemotherapy, Clara woke up to an empty bed. The clock read 2 a.m., and Victor's side of the bed was cold. Panic seized her chest as she stumbled through the house, calling his name. She found him in the living room, talking quietly on his phone. When she asked who he was speaking to, he froze, his face a mask of guilt. "Work," he said, too quickly, before brushing past her to the kitchen. That was the beginning of the end. Victor's absences became more frequent, and his excuses less believable. Clara's body grew weaker, but the ache in her heart was far worse than any physical pain. She was battling not just cancer, but the overwhelming sense of rejection from the one person she had trusted most. Each time she looked at him, she saw the man who had vowed to love her in sickness and in health, and yet, here he was, breaking that promise when she needed him most. 2 months after her diagnosis, the final blow came. Clara was sitting in the hospital chair, the chemical sting of chemotherapy coursing through her veins, when her phone buzzed. It was a text from Victor. "I can't do this anymore. I'm sorry." At first, she didn't understand. Her brain, foggy from the medication, couldn't process the words. She read them again and again, hoping they would change. But they didn't. When she called him, his phone went straight to voicemail. Panic set in, and she begged the nurse to help her get home early. As she stepped through the front door, the emptiness of the house confirmed her worst fears. His belongings were gone. Victor had abandoned her. The first night alone was unbearable. Clara lay in bed, her body trembling from the chemo side effects, her mind reeling from the betrayal. She screamed into the pillow, cursing Victor, cancer, and the cruel twist of fate that had taken her parents. The pain was suffocating, a black hole pulling her deeper into despair. She felt as though she were disappearing, her identity reduced to a broken woman defined by illness and abandonment. The days that followed were no better. Clara was too weak to cook or clean. Bills began to pile up, and the once cozy home she had shared with Victor now felt like a prison. Every corner of the house held memories of him, his favorite chair by the fireplace, the scent of his cologne lingering in the bathroom, the half-empty bottle of wine they had once shared during happier times. She couldn't escape him, and yet he was nowhere to be found. To make matters worse, Clara had no one to turn to. Her parents, her only family, were gone. Friends had drifted away over the years, and she hadn't been close enough to anyone to ask for help. She felt invisible, as though the world had moved on while she was left behind, fighting for a life she wasn't sure she wanted anymore. One evening, as the sun set behind the hills outside her window, Clara reached her breaking point. She sat at the dining table, staring at a bottle of painkillers she had been prescribed for the cancer treatments. The thought of ending it all crossed her mind. The idea of escape was tempting. No more pain, no more loneliness. She picked up the bottle, her hands trembling, and unscrewed the cap. But then, something stopped her. It wasn't a sudden burst of hope or a miraculous sign. It was a memory. She thought of her mother's voice, soft and reassuring, telling her as a child, "You're stronger than you think, Clara. Even when the world feels like it's falling apart, you can find your way." The memory brought fresh tears to her eyes, but for the first time in weeks, they weren't tears of despair. They were tears of defiance. Clara put the bottle down. That night, she made a promise to herself. She would survive. Not for Victor, not for anyone else, but for her. She didn't know how or where to begin, but she knew she couldn't let the man who had betrayed her win. If he had walked away so easily, then he didn't deserve to destroy her. The road ahead was still dark and uncertain, but for the first time since her diagnosis, Clara felt a flicker of determination. She might be broken, but she wasn't beyond repair. And in the quiet of her empty house, she resolved to take the first step toward reclaiming her life, even if she had to do it alone. The next morning, Clara woke to the hum of sunlight streaming through her bedroom window. The warmth on her skin was a faint reminder of life beyond her pain. Her body still felt heavy from the chemotherapy, and her joints ached as she swung her legs over the side of the bed. She hesitated, staring at the floor, unsure of how to begin her day. Each moment felt like climbing a mountain with no summit in sight. Her stomach growled, reminding her she hadn't eaten since Victor's departure. Hunger was a cruel necessity. She needed food to survive, but the thought of preparing anything was daunting. For the first time, Clara allowed herself to consider asking for help. A faint whisper in her mind urged her to reach out, even though her pride fought against it. That day at the hospital, Clara met Marissa. Marissa was a nurse with a kind face and a knack for noticing when people were struggling. She was in her mid-30s, with short, curly hair and a gentle demeanor that made patients feel at ease. Clara had seen her in passing but had never exchanged more than polite greetings. However, that afternoon, as Clara sat in the infusion room waiting for her chemo to begin, Marissa approached with a cup of tea. "You look like you could use this," Marissa said, handing Clara the steaming cup. Clara hesitated, surprised by the gesture. "Thank you," she said softly, her voice almost cracking from lack of use. She hadn't spoken much since Victor left, preferring the silence of her own thoughts. Marissa pulled up a chair and sat beside her. "Rough day?" she asked, her eyes filled with genuine concern. Clara didn't answer right away. She wasn't used to sharing her burdens with strangers. But something about Marissa's presence felt safe, like the warmth of an old friend. Clara found herself nodding. "Rough few weeks, actually," she admitted. Marissa didn't push for details. Instead, she stayed by Clara's side, chatting lightly about her day, the weather, and funny stories about her dog. The simplicity of the conversation was a balm to Clara's weary soul. For the first time in weeks, she felt a faint glimmer of connection, a reminder that not everyone in the world was as cold as Victor. The next time Clara saw Marissa, it was during a particularly grueling round of treatment. Her body was weak, and the side effects were hitting harder than usual. She could barely keep her head up, and nausea clawed at her stomach. As Clara struggled to hold herself together, Marissa appeared again, this time with a blanket and a small packet of crackers. "I noticed you didn't pack a snack," Marissa said, draping the blanket over Clara's shoulders. "These might help with the nausea." Clara's eyes filled with tears. She wasn't used to this level of kindness, especially from someone who owed her nothing. "You don't have to do this," she whispered, her voice trembling. Marissa smiled gently. "I know. But sometimes, a little kindness can make all the difference." Over the next few weeks, Marissa became a constant presence in Clara's life. She didn't just care for Clara as a patient, she cared for her as a person. She offered to drive Clara home when she was too weak to manage on her own, brought her homemade soups when she learned Clara wasn't eating well, and even sat with her during treatments to keep her company. One afternoon, as they sat together in the hospital garden, Clara finally opened up about Victor. The words spilled out like a dam breaking, her voice shaking as she recounted his betrayal. Marissa listened quietly, her expression a mixture of empathy and quiet anger. "He left you in the middle of this?" Marissa asked, her voice tinged with disbelief. Clara nodded, tears streaming down her cheeks. "I thought he loved me. I thought I mattered to him. But he just walked away." Marissa reached out and took Clara's hand. "You didn't deserve that. No one deserves that. But you're here, Clara. You're fighting. And that makes you stronger than he'll ever be." Marissa's encouragement became a lifeline for Clara. She wasn't just a nurse. She was a friend, a confidant, and a source of strength when Clara felt like giving up. Marissa helped Clara see that her worth wasn't defined by Victor's betrayal or her illness. She reminded Clara that she still had value, that she still had a life to live, even if it looked different than the one she had imagined. One day, Marissa surprised Clara by bringing her to a local support group for cancer patients. At first, Clara resisted. The thought of sharing her story with strangers felt overwhelming, and she wasn't sure she was ready to face the reality of her situation in front of others. But Marissa gently nudged her, promising that she didn't have to speak if she didn't want to. The group met in a small, cozy room at the community center. Chairs were arranged in a circle, and a pot of coffee brewed in the corner, filling the space with a comforting aroma. Clara sat quietly, listening as others shared their stories of struggle and resilience. There were tears, laughter, and moments of profound vulnerability. As she listened, Clara felt a spark of hope. She wasn't alone. Others had faced similar battles and had found ways to keep going. Maybe, just maybe, she could too. After the meeting, a woman named Anita approached Clara. She was in her 60s, with a warm smile and a twinkle in her eye. "First times?" Anita asked, handing Clara a cup of tea. Clara nodded. "I wasn't sure if I should come," she admitted. Anita chuckled. "I felt the same way my first time. But this group saved me." There's something powerful about sharing your story and hearing other stories. It reminds you that you're not as alone as you think. The words resonated with Clara. For so long, she had felt isolated in her pain, convinced that no one could understand what she was going through. But here, in this room, she saw glimpses of her own struggles reflected in the faces of others. It was a small comfort, but a comfort nonetheless. As weeks turned into months, Clara began to lean into the support she had found. Marissa's friendship and the connections she made through the support group became anchors in her life. Slowly but surely, Clara started to see glimmers of light in the darkness. She wasn't healed, not yet, but she was no longer drowning. And for the first time since Victor's departure, she began to believe that she might have a future worth fighting for. Little did Clara know, this newfound strength would become the foundation for the incredible transformation that lay ahead. While Clara was finding fragments of hope and strength in her darkest days, Victor's life had taken a vastly different turn. For him, the decision to leave Clara hadn't been as difficult as it should have been. The allure of Gabriella, his young and vivacious mistress, was far too tempting to resist. Her laughter was intoxicating, her touch electric, and her carefree spirit made him feel alive again, or so he thought. Victor rationalized his betrayal with ease. He told himself that Clara's illness was a burden too great for anyone to bear, especially for someone like him who deserved happiness. He convinced himself that Clara was better off without him. After all, she was too strong to need anyone. These lies were his comfort, his justification, as he packed his belongings and left her a cold text message. Victor and Gabriella moved into a sleek apartment in the city, complete with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a panoramic view of the skyline. It was a world away from the modest, cozy home he had shared with Clara. The apartment was decorated in Gabriella's style, modern, minimalistic, and filled with expensive furniture that Victor could barely afford. But Gabriella had expensive taste, and Victor, eager to keep her satisfied, spared no expense. At first, their relationship felt like a dream. Gabriella was spontaneous and uninhibited, the perfect antidote to what Victor had convinced himself was the monotony of life with Clara. They went out to lavish dinners, attended exclusive parties, and spent weekends at luxury resorts. Gabriella loved the finer things in life, and Victor was determined to provide them, even as his credit card bills began to pile up. But cracks in their relationship began to show sooner than Victor anticipated. Gabriella, for all her charm, was not the devoted partner Victor had imagined. Her affections were fickle, her moods mercurial. One moment she would shower him with attention, and the next, she would be distant and aloof. Victor found himself chasing her approval, bending over backward to keep her happy. He bought her designer handbags, jewelry, and even a new car, all in an attempt to win her love. One evening, Gabriella returned home hours later than she had promised, reeking of perfume that wasn't her own. Victor confronted her, his voice sharp with accusation. Gabriella, unbothered, simply laughed. "Don't be so dramatic, Victor," she said, brushing past him. "You're not my husband." The words hit him like a slap. For the first time, Victor realized that Gabriella had no intention of committing to him. She was with him for the lifestyle he provided, nothing more. And yet, he couldn't bring himself to leave. He had burned too many bridges, sacrificed too much, to go back now. Meanwhile, Victor's financial situation grew increasingly dire. The bills from Gabriella's extravagant tastes were relentless, and his income couldn't keep up. He had drained his savings and maxed out multiple credit cards. Each month, he promised himself he would cut back on expenses, but Gabriella's demands made that impossible. One night, as they sat in their expensive apartment overlooking the city, Victor tried to broach the topic of finances. "We need to start being more careful with money," he said hesitantly. "I'm under a lot of pressure right now." Gabriella rolled her eyes. "What pressure? You're the one who insisted on buying me that car." "I bought it because you said you wanted it," Victor retorted, his frustration bubbling to the surface. "But now I'm drowning in debt, and I need you to help me understand that." Gabriella stood up, her face hardening. "Understand? What I understand is that you're not the man I thought you were. If you can't keep up with me, maybe I need to find someone who can." Her words cut deep, but Victor couldn't muster a reply. He sat in stunned silence as Gabriella grabbed her purse and stormed out of the apartment. She didn't return that night or the next. As Gabriella's absences became more frequent, Victor began to spiral. He drank heavily, trying to drown out the growing sense of regret that gnawed at him. For the first time, he thought of Clara, not with the dismissive indifference he had cultivated, but with a pang of something resembling guilt. She had been loyal, loving, and supportive. She had stood by him during his struggles, and he had walked away the moment she needed him most. Victor's thoughts often drifted to the life he had abandoned. He imagined Clara in the home they had once shared, sitting alone at the dining table, the house too quiet without his presence. He wondered if she was still alive, if she was managing on her own. The idea that she might have moved on without him made his stomach churn. But instead of reaching out to Clara or facing the consequences of his actions, Victor buried himself deeper in denial. He blamed his financial troubles on the economy, his relationship issues on Gabriella's selfishness, and his unhappiness on everything but himself. It was easier to stay in the bubble of lies he had built than to confront the truth. Gabriella's final betrayal came 1 month later. Victor returned home from work to find the apartment empty. Gabriella's belongings were gone, and a single note was left on the kitchen counter. It read, "This isn't working. Don't try to find me." The words were cold, devoid of any emotion. Victor stared at the note, his hands trembling. His chest tightened as the reality of his situation sank in. He was alone, broke, and with no one to blame but himself. The life he had chased so eagerly had crumbled before his eyes, leaving him with nothing but regret. Victor's thoughts turned to Clara more frequently after Gabriella's departure. He found himself searching for her online, hoping to catch a glimpse of her life. When he found nothing, he considered reaching out, but shame held him back. What would he even say? How could he justify his actions? One day, Victor received a letter from a lawyer. His heart raced as he read the words, "You are hereby invited to the reading of Clara's will." The date and location were listed below. Victor froze, unsure of how to interpret the letter. Was Clara dead? The thought sent a chill down his spine. If she was, that meant the inheritance he had counted on might finally be within his grasp. But as the day of the reading approached, Victor couldn't shake the unease that gnawed at him. He had lost everything else: his dignity, his relationship, his financial stability. Now, the one thing he had clung to was the hope of benefiting from Clara's fortune. Little did he know, the upcoming inheritance day would be the greatest reckoning of his life, and the surprise awaiting him would change everything. While Victor's life unraveled in the chaos of bad decisions and self-inflicted wounds, Clara was quietly transforming. She had emerged from the shadow of betrayal with scars, yes, but also with a newfound sense of purpose. Every small victory, like cooking her own meal or painting another canvas, added a brick to the foundation of her rebuilding process. One rainy afternoon, as Clara sat by the window of her modest home, she held a pen in her trembling hand, staring at the blank pages of a notebook. It had been weeks since she had thought about Victor, but now her lawyer's voice echoed in her mind. "You should update your will." The suggestion had come after an offhand remark Clara made during one of their routine discussions about her finances. She had laughed bitterly, saying, "Victor's probably just waiting for me to die so he can live happily ever after." Her lawyer, a no-nonsense woman named Helena, had leaned forward, her expression serious. "Clara," she said firmly, "you have the power to make sure your future and your legacy is in the right hands. Don't let someone like Victor take what you've built." Clara took those words to heart. That rainy afternoon, she began listing the people and causes that had truly mattered to her. It was a quiet exercise at first, but with each stroke of her pen, a spark of determination grew inside her. She thought of Marissa, the nurse who had been her rock when no one else was there. She thought of Anita and the other women in her support group who had shared their stories and given her strength. And she thought of the countless people battling cancer who deserved a fighting chance at life just as much as she did. Victor, however, didn't make the list. Her hand froze for a moment as she wrote his name in the margins, only to cross it out with a firm line. No, she thought. He doesn't deserve this. Clara didn't hate Victor. In fact, she pitied him. But pity was not reason enough to hand over the inheritance she had worked so hard to secure, especially not after he had abandoned her at her lowest. This was her moment to reclaim control, not just of her finances, but of her narrative. The following week, Clara met with Helena to finalize her new will. Helena greeted her with a warm smile, but her tone was all business as she reviewed Clara's notes. "You've made some powerful choices here," Helena said, scanning the document. "Are you sure you don't want to leave anything to Victor? Sometimes people regret cutting ties completely." Clara hesitated for only a moment before shaking her head. "He made his choices," she said, her voice steady. "Now I'm making mine." Helena nodded, her respect for Clara evident. Together, They crafted a will that reflected Clara's values and ensured her estate would go to those who had truly supported her. A significant portion was allocated to cancer research and patient care programs, with a heartfelt donation reserved for the hospital that had treated her. She also set aside funds for Marissa, who had become not just a friend, but a surrogate family member. But Clara didn't stop there. She made one final request, a letter to be read aloud to Victor during the reading of the will. It wasn't an act of cruelty, but one of closure. Clara wanted him to hear, in her own words, the strength she had found in his absence. It was her way of taking back the power he had once stripped from her. Clara's health had stabilized over the past months, thanks to a combination of treatments and her unwavering resolve. Though the cancer was still a shadow in her life, she refused to let it define her. Each day was a gift, and she poured her energy into things that brought her joy. Her paintings, once a private outlet for her pain, had begun to attract attention. Marissa encouraged Clara to display her work at a local gallery, and to her surprise, people were captivated by the raw emotion in her art. Sales from her paintings provided an additional source of income, giving Clara even more freedom to shape her future. One evening, after a particularly successful gallery showing, Clara sat with Marissa over tea. They talked about everything: art, life, and the ways people could surprise you for better or worse. Finally, Marissa asked the question that had been on her mind for weeks. "Do you ever think about him?" she said gently, referring to Victor. Clara paused, her eyes thoughtful. "Sometimes," she admitted, "but not in the way I used to. I don't miss him. I don't even hate him. I think I'm grateful. If he hadn't left, I might never have found this version of myself. The one who's stronger, more alive." Marissa smiled, her eyes brimming with pride. "You're incredible, you know that?" Clara laughed softly. "No, I'm just surviving. But I'm learning that surviving can be beautiful too." And the weeks leading up to the reading of the will, Clara spent hours crafting the letter she would leave for Victor. She wanted it to be honest but not cruel, firm but not vindictive. It took multiple drafts, but eventually, she found the right words. The final version read, "Victor, there was a time when I believed you were my world. That without you, I was nothing. But life has a way of teaching us what we need to know, even if the lessons come wrapped in pain. When you left, I thought I would break. And for a while, I did. But from the cracks, something unexpected grew. Strength. I want you to know that I forgive you, not because you deserve it, but because I deserve peace. Forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting, and it certainly doesn't mean welcoming you back into my life. It means letting go of the power you once held over me. You won't find your name in my will, Victor. Instead, you'll find it in the margins, crossed out like the chapter of my life that no longer defines me. The wealth you coveted has been given to those who truly cared, those who stood by me when you walked away. I hope you find the answers you're searching for, but know this: the person I've become owes you nothing." She started her mornings with purpose. Each sunrise felt like an opportunity, not just a continuation of the days she had to endure. Her routine became a source of strength. Clara would sit by the window, the same spot where she had once written her will, and sip a cup of tea as the golden light poured into the room. The quiet moments allowed her to reflect on the distance she had traveled, emotionally and spiritually. She no longer woke with the weight of betrayal crushing her chest. Instead, there was a lightness, a quiet anticipation of what each day could bring. Her passion for painting had grown into something she never anticipated. What began as a therapeutic outlet had blossomed into a means of connection with the world. Clara poured her soul into every stroke, translating her pain, hope, and resilience onto the canvas. Each painting was a story, and as people bought her work, she realized she was sharing pieces of herself with strangers who found meaning in her art. One evening, as she worked on a new piece, a vivid landscape of a storm clearing over a mountain, she thought about the journey she had taken to reach this point. The colors she chose were bold, striking, full of life. They were not the muted tones of her early works, which had reflected her despair. These colors were a declaration. She had survived, and she would continue to thrive. Her newfound confidence extended beyond her art. Clara began volunteering at the hospital where she had undergone treatment. Marissa had encouraged her to share her story with others, and while Clara had initially hesitated, she eventually agreed. Speaking to patients who were in the position she had once been in was both humbling and empowering. She saw her own fear and pain reflected in their eyes, but she also saw glimmers of hope when she told them about her journey. One particular patient, a young woman named Sophia, reminded Clara of herself in the early days of her diagnosis. Sophia was withdrawn, her eyes shadowed by the weight of her illness. Clara sat beside her during one of their sessions and spoke softly about the darkest moments of her life, the betrayal, the loneliness, the anger. But she also spoke of the strength she had found, the friends she had made, and the unexpected beauty that had come from her suffering. "You don't have to have it all figured out today," Clara said, taking Sophia's hand. "Some days, just surviving is enough. And on those days, you remind yourself that even the smallest steps forward are victories." Sophia's lips quivered into a faint smile, and for the first time, Clara saw a flicker of hope in her eyes. Moments like these reminded Clara why she had chosen to dedicate her life to helping others. Her pain had not been in vain. It had given her the tools to uplift others in their darkest hours. Despite her progress, there were still moments when memories of Victor crept into her thoughts. These memories no longer brought pain, but they served as a reminder of the woman she used to be. Naive, eager to please, willing to overlook her own needs for the sake of someone who didn't deserve her. She didn't resent Victor anymore, but she also knew she would never let anyone like him into her life again. The boundaries she had built were firm, and she guarded her peace fiercely. One afternoon, as Clara walked through the local park, she noticed a group of children playing by a fountain. Their laughter was infectious, and Clara found herself smiling despite the weight of her thoughts. She had come to the park to clear her mind, to reflect on the will reading that was only days away. The event would bring Victor back into her life, however briefly, and she wasn't sure how she felt about that. The letter she had written to him was tucked away in her lawyer's office, sealed and ready to be delivered. She had gone over the words countless times, ensuring they were exactly what she wanted to say. But no amount of preparation could completely calm the nerves that came with confronting her past. She knew Victor would expect to walk away from the reading with her fortune. The thought almost made her laugh. He still hadn't learned that the world didn't revolve around him. As Clara sat on a bench near the fountain, she watched a little girl carefully balancing on the edge of the stone basin. The child's mother stood nearby, her arms outstretched in case she fell. The image struck Clara deeply. It reminded her of the support she had found in people like Marissa, Helena, and the women in her support group. They had been her safety net, catching her when she stumbled and encouraging her to try again when she thought she couldn't go on. Clara realized that she had become that safety net for others now. Through her art, her volunteering, and her presence, she was giving people the same hope that had been given to her. It was a humbling thought, and it filled her with gratitude for the path she had taken. The days leading up to the will reading were a mix of calm resolve and quiet anticipation. Clara spent her time surrounded by the things that brought her peace: painting, walking in nature, and connecting with the people who had become her chosen family. She wasn't afraid of seeing Victor again. She was ready. This wasn't about revenge. It wasn't about proving anything to him. It was about closing a chapter of her life that no longer served her. The letter was her final act of letting go, a declaration that she had moved on and found joy despite the pain he had caused. Clara knew Victor would walk into that room expecting to leave with everything. But when the truth was revealed, he would learn that she had built a life far richer than anything money could buy, a life filled with love, resilience, and purpose. And no matter what he felt, whether it was anger, regret, or disbelief, Clara would walk away unburdened, her heart free to embrace the bright future she had created for herself. Victor sat in the dimly lit apartment that now felt more like a tomb than the luxury retreat he had imagined. The once pristine walls bore scuff marks from furniture Gabriella had taken when she left, leaving behind only her empty perfume bottles and a faint sense of her presence. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the occasional creak of the building settling and the hum of the refrigerator. His empire of pleasure and indulgence had crumbled around him, leaving nothing but debt and regret. The stack of unopened bills on the counter loomed like a mountain. Each envelope represented another consequence of his choices, another reminder of how far he had fallen. His phone buzzed, a rare occurrence now that most of his friends had distanced themselves. He glanced at the screen and saw a notification from the lawyer handling Clara's will. The message was simple. Reminder. Will reading, Friday, 10 a.m. Victor's lips curled into a bitter smile. Despite everything, this was the one card he still held. Clara's fortune, the one thing he had counted on since her diagnosis, was within his reach. He had endured humiliation, financial ruin, and the collapse of his relationship with Gabriella, but the prospect of that inheritance kept him going. He imagined the money clearing his debts, allowing him to rebuild his life, perhaps even attract someone new. The thought filled him with a fleeting sense of triumph. But that triumph was fragile, like a paper mask hiding the growing unease in his chest. Victor hadn't heard anything about Clara in months. The last he knew, she was still undergoing treatment. Was she even alive? The thought unsettled him in a way he couldn't quite understand. He brushed it aside, focusing instead on what he assumed would be a straightforward process: arrive at the reading, sign a few papers, and walk away with her estate. Friday morning arrived, gray and overcast, as though the universe had decided to mirror the storm brewing inside Victor. He dressed carefully, choosing a dark suit and tie in an attempt to convey somber respect, though his true motives were far from altruistic. He glanced at himself in the mirror, adjusting his collar. The man staring back at him looked older, wearier. His once confident gaze now carried shadows of desperation. The lawyer's office was a modest building downtown, far less imposing than Victor had expected. He parked his car, an aging sedan he could barely afford to maintain, and walked toward the entrance, clutching his briefcase as though it contained some shred of his dignity. Inside, the waiting room was quiet, with soft classical music playing overhead. Victor's eyes scanned the room, but he saw no familiar faces. He had half expected to see a representative from Clara's hospital or perhaps one of her friends. Instead, there was only Helena, the lawyer, sitting behind her desk with a calm, unreadable expression. "Mr. Victor," she said, rising to greet him. "Thank you for coming." Victor offered a tight smile, masking his nervousness. "Of course. I assume everything is in order." Helena gestured toward a conference room. "We'll begin shortly. Please have a seat." Victor stepped into the room, his footsteps echoing on the polished floor. A long table dominated the space, with neatly arranged papers at its center. He took a seat, placing his briefcase on the table. His palms were damp, but he told himself it was excitement, not anxiety. Helena entered moments later, carrying a folder that looked far too thin for what Victor imagined would be a sizable estate. She placed it in front of her and opened it with deliberate precision. "Before we proceed," Helena began, her tone professional yet firm, "I must inform you that Clara left explicit instructions for this reading. She wanted certain matters to be addressed directly to you." Victor's brow furrowed. "What kind of matters?" Helena didn't answer immediately. Instead, she pulled out an envelope sealed with Clara's familiar handwriting. Victor's stomach churned as he recognized the loops and curves of her script. It was a letter addressed to him. "This is from Clara," Helena said, sliding the envelope across the table. "I'll give you a moment to read it before we continue." Victor hesitated, staring at the envelope as though it might burn him. Slowly, he reached for it, his fingers trembling. He broke the seal and unfolded the letter, his heart pounding in his chest. The words hit him like a tidal wave. "Victor, if you're reading this, it means you've come for what you believe you're owed. But let me be clear, you are not here because of your love or loyalty. You are here because of greed. The same greed that led you to abandon me in my darkest hour. I want you to know that I've forgiven you. Not because you deserve it, but because I refuse to let your betrayal define me. Forgiveness has freed me, Victor. It has allowed me to move forward, to rebuild, to live a life of purpose and joy. You, however, will not benefit from the fortune I've worked so hard to protect. Instead, my estate will go to those who truly stood by me, people like Marissa, my nurse, and the Cancer Foundation that saved my life. You taught me a lesson, Victor. You showed me the importance of valuing myself and my worth. For that, I thank you. But this is where your chapter in my story ends. Clara. Victor's hands shook as he lowered the letter. His face burned with shame and anger, but beneath it all was a hollow pit of disbelief. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. Clara was supposed to have died quietly, leaving him to pick up the pieces of her life and shape them into his own. Instead, she had turned the narrative against him, leaving him with nothing but the weight of his own choices. Helena cleared her throat, breaking the tense silence. As outlined in her will, Clara's assets have been distributed to the Cancer Foundation and the individuals she specified. You are not a beneficiary. Victor clenched his fists, his knuckles white. She can't do this, he stammered. I was her husband. Helena's expression didn't waver. Legally, she had every right to allocate her estate as she saw fit. The documents are airtight. Victor slumped back in his chair, the reality crashing over him like a wave. He was broke, abandoned, and now utterly humiliated. Clara had outmaneuvered him, her strength shining brighter in death, or so he assumed, than he had ever imagined possible. But as Victor gathered his things and stumbled out of the office, he couldn't shake the nagging thought that Clara wasn't defeated, even by her illness. She had risen above the ashes of their marriage, crafting a legacy that celebrated her resilience. And while Victor had lost everything, Clara had found freedom, a victory he would never understand. The day after Victor saw Clara's painting in the gallery, he woke up with an unfamiliar sense of restlessness. His apartment, once a symbol of freedom, now felt like a cage. The walls seemed to close in on him, filled with echoes of his past mistakes. The painting had stirred something inside him, something he hadn't felt in years, a desire to change. But change was a distant, daunting mountain, and he wasn't sure if he had the strength to climb it. Victor shuffled to the kitchen, the linoleum floor cold beneath his bare feet. He opened the fridge, staring at its near-empty shelves. A carton of milk, past its expiration date, and a wilted head of lettuce mocked him with their uselessness. He sighed, shutting the door. The man who had once indulged in lavish meals with Gabriella was now reduced to scraping by, unsure of where his next meal would come from. He sat at the kitchen table, his head in his hands. Clara's words from the letter haunted him. You taught me the importance of valuing myself and my worth. For that, I thank you. But this is where your chapter in my story ends. Victor had spent so much time blaming others for his failures. Clara, Gabriella, even the world, that he had never truly faced himself. Now, the truth stared him in the face. He had been the architect of his own downfall. As the hours passed, Victor found himself drawn back to the gallery. He didn't know what he was looking for, closure, perhaps, or some connection to the woman he had betrayed. The memory of Clara's painting lingered in his mind, its vibrant colors and hopeful message a stark contrast to the darkness he felt within himself. When he arrived, the gallery was quiet, the air filled with the faint scent of paint and varnish. He walked through the exhibit slowly, his eyes scanning each piece of art. Most of the paintings were beautiful but impersonal, lacking the raw emotion that had drawn him to Clara's work. Then he saw it again, the mountain bathed in golden light. Victor stood in front of the painting, his chest tight. The storm clouds in the image seemed to reflect his own turmoil, but the sunrise above them reminded him that even the darkest storms eventually passed. He reached out, his fingers hovering just above the glass. For a brief moment, he felt connected to Clara in a way he hadn't in years. Beautiful, isn't it? A voice said behind him. Victor turned to see an older woman with kind eyes and a gentle smile. She wore a name tag that read Margaret, gallery curator. It is, Victor replied, his voice hoarse. The artist? Clara, she's incredible. Margaret nodded. She truly is. Her story is just as inspiring as her work. "Did you know this painting represents her recovery from cancers?" Victor swallowed hard, unsure of how to respond. He nodded, avoiding Margaret's gaze. "She's dedicated so much of her life to helping others now," Margaret continued, her voice warm with admiration. "This auction is raising money for the cancer foundation she supports. It's amazing what she's accomplished." Victor's chest tightened further. He had always seen Clara as strong, but hearing about her work and her resilience made him realize just how much he had underestimated her. While he had been wallowing in self-pity, she had been building a legacy. Margaret studied him for a moment. "You seem like you know her," she said gently. Victor hesitated, the weight of his guilt pressing down on him. I used to," he admitted. "A long time ago." Margaret's expression softened. "Well, if you have the chance to reconnect, you should. Clara has a way of bringing light to everyone she meets." Victor nodded, but the thought of seeing Clara again filled him with dread. He wasn't sure he deserved her forgiveness, or even the chance to speak to her. Over the next few days, Victor couldn't get Clara's painting or Margaret's words out of his mind. He began to reflect more deeply on his life and the choices that had brought him to this point. He thought about the man he had been when he first met Clara, a man full of dreams and potential, and wondered if it was too late to find that part of himself again. In an attempt to start over, Victor began taking small steps to rebuild his life. He sold the few valuable items he had left, including the watch Gabriella had given him, to pay off part of his mounting debts. He reached out to a financial advisor for help creating a plan to manage what little money he had. It was humbling work, but it gave him a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in years. Victor also started volunteering at a local community center. It wasn't much, helping with food distribution and cleaning up after events, but it reminded him of the importance of giving back. He found solace in the gratitude of the people he helped, their smiles a small but powerful reminder that even the smallest acts of kindness could make a difference. Through these experiences, Victor began to understand the lesson Clara had tried to teach him. Her forgiveness wasn't an invitation to re-enter her life. It was a challenge to find his own path to redemption. He realized he couldn't undo the past, but he could strive to be better in the future. Months passed, and Victor continued to rebuild. He still thought about Clara often, but his thoughts were no longer consumed by regret. Instead, he felt a quiet sense of gratitude for the lessons her strength had taught him. He didn't know if he would ever see her again, but he hoped she was happy, surrounded by the light she had created. One evening, Victor received a flyer in the mail for a charity gala benefiting the cancer foundation Clara supported. Her name was listed as a featured artist, with several of her paintings set to be auctioned. Victor's heart raced as he read the flyer. It was an opportunity to see her, to thank her, even if only from a distance. He debated attending, unsure if his presence would be welcome. But in the end, he decided to go, not for himself, but to support the cause that had become so important to her. He wore his one remaining suit, now carefully pressed and mended, and arrived at the gala with a mixture of nervousness and determination. As he entered the grand hall, filled with laughter and the clinking of glasses, Victor's eyes searched for Clara. He spotted her near the stage, surrounded by a group of admirers. She looked radiant, her smile brighter than he had ever remembered. She was a woman transformed, a testament to resilience and grace. Victor stayed in the background, content to watch her from afar. When her painting was unveiled for auction, he felt a swell of pride, knowing how much it represented her journey. The bids quickly escalated, and the final sale brought a round of applause. Clara's joy was palpable as she thanked the crowd, her voice steady and full of gratitude. Victor left the gala without speaking to her. He didn't need to. Seeing her happy, thriving, and surrounded by love was enough. As he walked out into the cool night air, he felt a sense of peace he hadn't known in years. Clara's chapter in his life was truly over, but her strength and forgiveness had given him the courage to begin writing his own. Victor returned to his small apartment after the gala, his mind swirling with a mix of emotions he couldn't fully process. The sight of Clara, vibrant and alive, had left him shaken. He had prepared himself for the possibility of seeing her again, but nothing could have prepared him for the sheer magnitude of her transformation. She was no longer the woman he had abandoned. She was stronger, brighter, and more confident than ever. He placed his jacket carefully over the back of a chair and sank onto the couch, staring at the blank wall in front of him. For years, he had clung to the belief that Clara's life would crumble without him, that she would never recover from his betrayal. But now he realized how wrong he had been. Clara hadn't just survived, she had thrived. And in doing so, she had held a mirror up to Victor's own failures, forcing him to confront the man he had become. The next few weeks passed in a blur of introspection and quiet determination. Victor threw himself into his volunteer work at the community center, finding solace in the simple act of helping others. The work grounded him, giving him a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in years. He began to notice small changes in himself, a softening of the bitterness that had once consumed him, a growing appreciation for the moments of connection he shared with the people around him. One afternoon, as he was organizing boxes of donated clothing, a young woman approached him with a hesitant smile. "Victor, right?" she asked, her voice warm and friendly. He nodded, wiping his hands on his jeans. "That's me. How can I help you?" The woman introduced herself as Elena, one of the coordinators at the center. "I just wanted to say thank you," she said. "You've been such a big help around here. The families we serve really appreciate it. And so do we." Victor felt a faint flush of embarrassment. He wasn't used to being thanked. "I'm just doing what I can," he said, shrugging. Elena's smile widened. "Well, it makes a difference. Don't underestimate that." Her words stayed with him long after she walked away. For so long, Victor had felt like his life had no meaning, like he was nothing more than the sum of his mistakes. But now, for the first time in years, he felt a flicker of hope, a belief that he could be more than the man he had been. Meanwhile, Clara's life continued to flourish. Her work with the Cancer Foundation had grown beyond what she ever imagined, and her paintings were now in high demand. She spent her days juggling meetings, gallery exhibitions, and volunteer work, all while maintaining the balance she had fought so hard to achieve. Though her schedule was hectic, she made time for the things that mattered most: quiet mornings in her garden, dinners with friends, and moments of reflection that reminded her how far she had come. One afternoon, Clara received a letter in the mail. It was from the gallery that had hosted the auction, informing her of the final totals raised for the Cancer Foundation. The amount was staggering, far beyond her initial expectations. Tears filled her eyes as she read the letter, overwhelmed by the generosity of those who had supported her cause. As she set the letter down, her thoughts drifted to the gala. She hadn't seen Victor that night, but she had sensed his presence. It was a strange feeling, knowing he had been there, watching her from the shadows. Part of her had wondered if he would approach her, if he would try to explain or apologize. But he hadn't, and for that, she was grateful. She didn't need his words or his regret. She had already found her peace. Victor's life continued to evolve, though the process was slow and often challenging. He took on a part-time job at a local hardware store, using the income to chip away at his debts. The work was humbling but honest, and for the first time in years, Victor felt a sense of pride in what he was doing. He no longer cared about appearances or status. He cared about building a life he could be proud of. One evening, as he was locking up the store, he received a call from Elena.
"Hey, Victor," she said.
"I know this is last minute, but we're short on volunteers for the food drive tomorrow. Any chance you can help?" Victor didn't hesitate. "Of course. What time do you need me?" The next morning, Victor arrived at the community center early, ready to help. The food drive was bustling with activity, families lining up to receive groceries and volunteers working tirelessly to keep things running smoothly. As Victor handed out bags of fresh produce, he felt a deep sense of fulfillment. These small acts of kindness, though seemingly insignificant, were changing him in ways he couldn't fully articulate. Toward the end of the event, a woman approached him, her face lined with exhaustion but her eyes filled with gratitude. "Thank you for doing this," she said, her voice trembling. "It means so much to us." Victor smiled, his chest tightening. "You're welcome." I'm glad we could help." As the woman walked away, Victor felt a surge of emotion he hadn't expected. This was what mattered: connection, compassion, and the simple act of showing up for others. He realized that this was the life he wanted to live, one defined not by selfish ambition, but by meaningful contribution. Clara, too, was finding new ways to grow. Though her work with the Cancer Foundation consumed much of her time, she had recently begun exploring other passions. She started teaching art classes at a local community center, sharing her love of painting with children and adults alike. The classes brought her immense joy, reminding her of the healing power of creativity. One evening, as she was cleaning up after a class, a young girl approached her, clutching a painting she had made. "Miss Clara," the girl said shyly, "do you think I could be an artist like you some days?" Clara knelt down to meet the girl's gaze, her smile warm.
"Of course you can," she said.
"All it takes is practice and believing in yourself." The girl beamed, her confidence blossoming under Clara's encouragement. As she watched the child run off to show her parents the painting, Clara felt a deep sense of fulfillment. She had found her purpose, not just in creating art, but in using it to inspire and uplift others. Though their paths never crossed again, both Victor and Clara continued to grow in their own ways. Clara's life was filled with light and purpose, a testament to her resilience and strength. Victor's journey was quieter, marked by small but significant steps toward redemption. He knew he could never undo the past, but he had learned to accept it and use it as a foundation for a better future. In the end, they were both living proof that even the deepest wounds could heal, and even the darkest chapters could lead to brighter tomorrows. Clara had found her freedom, and Victor had found the courage to change. Their stories, though intertwined, had diverged into two separate paths, each leading toward a life worth living. Victor sat at the edge of his bed, staring out the window at the cityscape beyond. The early morning light painted the buildings in soft hues of pink and gold, a stark contrast to the turmoil in his chest. It had been over a year since the day of Clara's will reading, and his life had transformed in ways he never thought possible. Yet, the memory of her letters still lingered, a constant reminder of the person he had been and the person he was trying to become. He thought about the long road he had traveled since that fateful day. The volunteer work at the community center had grown into something much bigger. Victor had taken on more responsibilities, helping to organize events and fundraisers. It was fulfilling work, and he found himself connecting with people in ways he never had before. The once self-centered man who had measured his worth by wealth and status now found joy in the simple act of giving back. But despite the progress he had made, there was one thing Victor couldn't shake: the knowledge that he had never truly apologized to Clara. He had avoided reaching out, convinced it was better to leave her in peace. She had moved on, built a life filled with purpose and happiness. What right did he have to intrude on that? And yet, a part of him yearned for closure, not for his sake, but for hers. He wanted her to know that her forgiveness had not been wasted, that her strength had inspired him to change. He didn't expect her to welcome him back into her life. He only wanted her to know the impact she had made. That afternoon, Victor found himself walking through the park where he had often gone to think. The familiar oak tree stood tall and steady, its branches swaying gently in the breeze. He sat on the bench beneath it, memories flooding back. This was where he had first begun to face the truth about himself, where he had allowed himself to grieve for the man he had been and the life he had lost. As he sat there, a young boy ran past, chasing after a kite that danced in the wind. The boy's laughter was infectious, and Victor couldn't help but smile. Moments like this reminded him of the beauty in the small things, the moments he had overlooked in his quest for more. A voice interrupted his thoughts. "Victor?" He turned, startled, to see Marissa standing a few feet away. She looked exactly as he remembered, calm, composed, with an air of quiet strength. For a moment, Victor was at a loss for words. "Marissa," he said finally, rising to his feet. "It's been a long time." She smiled, though there was a hint of curiosity in her eyes.
"It has."
"I didn't expect to see you here." Victor gestured to the bench.
"I come here sometimes."
It helps me think. Marissa nodded, her gaze steady. You look different. Happier. Victor hesitated, then nodded. I've been trying to turn things around. It hasn't been easy, but I think I'm finally on the right path. Marissa studied him for a moment before speaking. Clara would be glad to hear that. Her words hit Victor like a bolt of lightning. You still talk to her? He asked, his voice filled with a mixture of hope and fear. Marissa smiled. Of course. She's doing well, Victor. Better than ever. Victor's chest tightened. I'm glad to hear that, he said softly. She deserves all the happiness in the world. Marissa's expression grew thoughtful. Do you want me to tell her I saw you? Victor hesitated, the question hanging heavily in the air. Finally, he shook his head.
No.
I don't want to disrupt her life. She's moved on, and that's how it should be. Marissa nodded, her eyes filled with understanding. For what it's worth, I think she's already forgiven you. But maybe it's time you forgive yourself. The words stayed with Victor long after Marissa had gone. Forgive himself. It sounded so simple, yet it was the hardest thing he had ever tried to do. But as he walked home that evening, he realized that Marissa was right. Forgiveness wasn't about forgetting the past. It was about making peace with it and allowing himself to move forward. Clara, meanwhile, was preparing for a major event in her life. The Cancer Foundation she had been supporting had asked her to be the keynote speaker at their annual gala, an honor that filled her with both excitement and nerves. The event would be the largest she had ever attended, with hundreds of influential people coming together to support the cause. As she rehearsed her speech in her small but cozy studio, Clara thought about the journey that had brought her here. She remembered the nights of despair, the moments when she had doubted her strength, and the people who had lifted her up when she couldn't stand on her own. And, strangely enough, she thought of Victor, not with anger or bitterness, but with gratitude. His betrayal had been the catalyst for her transformation, forcing her to discover a strength she never knew she had. The night of the gala arrived, and Clara stood backstage, her heart pounding in her chest. She adjusted the hem of her dress and took a deep breath, reminding herself why she was there. This wasn't about her. It was about the lives she could touch, the hope she could offer to those still fighting their battles. When Clara stepped onto the stage, the room erupted into applause. She smiled, her nerves melting away as she took her place at the podium. She spoke from the heart, sharing her story with honesty and vulnerability. She talked about the pain and loss, but also about the resilience and joy she had found on the other side. When she finished, the audience rose to their feet, their applause echoing through the grand hall. Victor heard about Clara's speech through a news article shared by one of the community center volunteers. The article included a photo of her standing on stage, radiant and confident, with a caption that read, "From survivor to advocate, Clara's journey inspires thousands." He stared at the image, his heart swelling with pride and sadness. Clara had become everything he had once tried to take from her, a symbol of hope and strength. He closed the article, his decision clear. It was time to let go, to release the last remnants of his guilt and focus on the life he was building. Victor walked to the park that evening, the cool air filling his lungs as he sat beneath the oak tree. He thought of Clara, sending a silent wish into the universe for her continued happiness. And for the first time, he felt a sense of peace, knowing that both of them had found their own versions of freedom. Clara and Victor's paths had diverged, but their stories were forever intertwined, a testament to the power of resilience, forgiveness, and the unyielding strength